Zach Cope, Divided World, Divided Class. Introduction. This book began as an attempt to understand the regularity and intensity of racist and imperialist attitudes and beliefs within the working class of the advanced capitalist nations, in order to explain the evident disinterest and disdain with which it greets revolutionary socialist ideas. My interest in the intersectionality of class and national identities was first sparked by coming to grips with the phenomenon of Northern Irish working-class unionism, that is, support for British authority over all or part of Ireland. Having ascertained that this was mostly not the product of, quote, false class consciousness, political naivete, or national democratic aspirations, but rather the ideological auxiliary of the struggle by the Protestant working class of the northeast of Ireland to preserve those relative material privileges granted it by imperialism, I began to investigate whether the structural explanation for systematically reactionary behavior by groups of workers was applicable on a wider geographic scale. The present volume is intended, firstly, as a contribution to resurgent discussions on class politics and the future of world capitalism. Its central argument is that the assumption that material gains for workers in the imperialist countries represents advances in the direction of socialism, public ownership and workers' control of the major means of production, is no longer tenable, these being afforded only by heightened exploitation of dependent nation workers. The connivance of First World workers in the maintenance of the current international division of labor, routinely obfuscated by opportunist apologetics, stressing a radical dichotomy between the ruling class and citizenries of First World countries, can be seen in how they have functionally provided indispensable ideological and practical support to imperialist governments, parties, armies, employers, mass media, and labor unions. No political party, trade union, television channel, or newspaper, even supposed, quote, liberal ones, can be too conservative, militarist, nationalist, or racist to gain a mass following amongst First World workers. Secondly, the book is a statement on the nature of chauvinist bigotry and its relation to class struggle in today's world. Extremely destructive national, quote, racial, and cultural prejudices can be witnessed in recent anti-immigrant rioting by poor South Africans, tensions between Indians and Pakistanis, and between Sinhalese and Tamil groups in Sri Lanka. Ostensibly ethnic and religious conflicts in and around the former Soviet Union, and the Islamophobic, anti-Roma, and anti-Black racism prevalent throughout Europe and the United States today. Footnote. In this book, I will capitalize the word Black to indicate the national dimension of the African-descended population of the United States, whereas I will refer to lowercase black people as those persons of African descent inhabiting majority white societies, to indicate their status as an oppressed minority, as opposed to a nation as such. Throughout the work, I will refrain from using quotation marks around the words black and white, even though, properly speaking, the supposed color of a people's skin tells us little about their social existence that is not better explained with reference to their nationality. End footnote. Beginning of a second footnote. On Sinhala and Tamil. Sinhala chauvinism is mostly attributable to the class interests of the petty bourgeoisie, and, above all, to the divide et impera policies of the Sri Lankan ruling class. The sons of the middle class Sinhalese recognize that their exclusive opportunity to secure university entrance, official and governmental positions, access to local markets, etc., depends in part upon the repression of their Tamil counterparts. As Tamil writer, activist, and scientist S. Sivasagaram argues in an excellent essay on the national question in Sri Lanka, the petty bourgeoisies in that country have been the main force for chauvinist electoral politics, whilst the main parties have championed the class interests of the, quote, feudal capitalist classes. It is these latter classes, fractious as they are in relation to the hegemony of foreign capital, who have consistently manipulated nationalist sentiments to divide the Sri Lankan people along ethnic lines, and, as Sivasagaram has argued, have been encouraged by imperialism to do so. The Tamil political leadership has, over time, striven to convince the Tamil masses that language and cultural discrimination is the principal, indeed the only, political issue facing them, and has played down issues of class, represented amongst Tamils by the Communist Party of Sri Lanka and the Trotskyist LSSP, the Lanka Sama Samaja Party, or Ceylon Equal Society Party. It is pointed to the clear Sinhala chauvinist aspects of SLFP policy, a party which otherwise might have provided an anti-imperialist platform to sway Sri Lankan politics in a democratic pro-Tamil direction. Eager for U.S. and Israeli anti-communist patronage, the leadership of the Tamil nation in Sri Lanka consistently opposed all SLFP legislation that may have strengthened working-class national unity. In any case, both the CP and, earlier still, the LSSP are guilty of having tailed the SLFP in a parliamentary alliance with the capitalist parties, and pushing the Sri Lankan left in a bourgeois direction. The Tamil leadership largely ignored those revolutionary trends within the Sinhalese working class, which broke with the national chauvinist and reformist politics of the CP and LSSP. End of footnote. Continued from Anti-Roma and Anti-Black Racism Prevalent Throughout Europe and the United States Today. Marxian theorists, particularly of the Gramscian, Althusserian, and, quote, post-Marxist varieties, typically understand working-class racism as being a form of, quote, false class consciousness, whether inculcated by a cynical ruling class determined to sow division amongst an otherwise unified proletariat, or the product of socio-epistemic myopia precluding accurate identification of, quote, the enemy. Although in many of the aforementioned cases, some workers undoubtedly, quote, follow in the steps of their bourgeoisie, focusing their political activity against better-off foreigners or ethnic minorities, it would be extremely facile to suppose that all instances of national chauvinism must be understood in this manner. While anti-racist approaches highlighting the hegemonic strategies of ideological state apparatuses are valuable for deconstructing the mythology of advanced capitalist, quote, cultural pluralism, the methodology they employ is often a priori and idealist. Racism, for example, is simply presumed to conflict with the real interests of all workers, and thereby to be a set of ideas disconnected from material circumstances. Moreover, where the same corporate media propaganda system operates internationally, the, quote, false class consciousness theory of bigotry cannot explain why some workers respond positively and some negatively to its reactionary messages. Moreover, it cannot explain why workers would cling to an ideology which has persistently damaged their class interests for over a period of centuries. If Einstein was right to think that the mark of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, then, for the Euro-Marxist, the first world working class must be mad indeed. Other left and liberal approaches, by contrast, relate national and racial chauvinism to intraproletarian conflict over jobs and benefits. In comparison to idealist analyses, these are far more realistic in attempting to connect chauvinist ideologies to struggles over material conditions. However, sociological realism can become mired in empiricism when it abjures class analysis. To adduce a concrete understanding of why a social group espouses one or other form of exclusivist chauvinism, it is necessary to contextualize its commitment within the material structures of class and nation, and not merely to point to competition or the mere presence of an ethnic minority. Simply put, some social groups, including certain groups of workers, are more prone to act on chauvinist principles because they benefit from doing so. The present work distinguishes itself from much anti-racist analysis by situating its class analysis approach internationally. Racism does not occur within the confines of a hermetically isolated society, but within an international class system fundamentally structured by imperialism. The ethnic, quote, racial or religious composition of especially oppressed sections of the first world working class is intrinsically related to the geographic, military, legal, cultural, and economic mechanics of imperialist national oppression. Against reductionist approaches to conflicts within the working class, the methodology involved in the following examination of racial, ethnic, and national chauvinism is materialist, critical, and realist. Where much mainstream academic and liberal political opinion has concentrated on exclusivist chauvinism as the product of misunderstanding and or mistaken identity, in short, as a set of erroneous ideas, eradicable through education. The task of the sociologist is to analyze the objective causes and conditions for working class disunity. As U.S. sociology professor David Wellman argues, racism, a virulent strand of chauvinism, is not merely a set of prejudices in the minds of some individuals. It is not possible to educate racism out of existence, since racial oppression does not originate through indoctrination programs by racists. Quote, racism is a social relation, not the mere ravings of racist subjects. End quote. The present work argues that racism is the ideological expression of a system of profoundly unequal economic and political relations. To oppose racist thinking means to render it inoperative by practically abolishing those institutions which accord it significance. Conceiving exclusivist chauvinism as grounded in a soi-disant culture of intolerance is an inadequate sociological approach. A more substantial analysis connects racism to material inequalities bound up with the mode of production within which it arises, and which it tends to facilitate. Racial and ethnic chauvinism emanates, resonates, and is propagated within established social structures. As such, the present understanding of racism finds its focal heuristic in imperialist society, the concrete amalgam of psychological, social, and political racializing modes of existence. The construction of this society is not viewed from the perspective of struggle between so-called, quote, races, which in fact do not exist in nature, but from the perspective of the construction of society itself, that is, of society's dominant mode of production. So-called, quote, races are not mere imaginary constructs, but ideological synecdoches reflecting the economic position of peoples relative to that of the hegemonic bourgeoisie, and class fractions thereof, nationally and internationally. There is currently a large body of work examining exclusivist bigotry as the product of the illiberal minds of its adherents. Well-funded academic institutes, quote, civil society bodies, and philanthropic trusts seek to realize ways in which all parties involved in so-called, quote, ethnic conflict can have their perspectives heard, acknowledged, and accepted without undue favor or denigration. Clearly, the much vaunted liberal goals of tolerance and reconciliation appear humane, rational, and laudable. Yet the methodological idealism of mainstream theories of racism, the treatment of racist ideas as active social agents detached from material conditions, and of race and ethnicity as the discursive master signifiers, has prevented scholars from really getting to the roots of the problem. Liberal perspectives on racism, by ignoring not only structurally grounded power and privilege, but also underlying processes of capital accumulation, have invariably bolstered the notion that racism and ethnocentrism are products of personal bias. The left liberal theory of justice, as formulated under the rubrics of multiculturalism, pluralism, consocianationalism, and communitarianism, no less than its classical, quote, liberal opponent, which is now content to blame multiculturalism for the alleged failure of certain ethnic communities to integrate into mainstream first world society, has been unable to effectively challenge bigotry. Despite differences of emphasis and opinion on philosophical matters, both the communitarian and liberal individualist schools of contemporary political justice theory are alike in treating prejudice as a matter of opinion or identity, rather than something which cannot be understood, let alone remedied, without regard to structurally situated social practice. Quote, prejudice has become a tacitly understood watchword for strategies of liberal conservative conflict management, rather than something to be overcome through scientific practice. By contrast, socialist critiques of racism seek to radically transform the society from which it is sustained and generated. Racism and related forms of bigotry should be understood as ways of thinking that are all too appropriate to the lived experiences and self-identities of first world citizens. The various forms of national chauvinism, discussed in the first part of this book, are in large measure the ideological correlates of particular class relations produced by and in the service of world capitalism. Before proceeding further, however, we must try to explain more precisely what we mean by some of our principal terms, namely class, nation, and nationalism, race and racism, core, periphery, and semi-periphery, dependency, and labor aristocracy. Only then can we begin to clarify the historic relationship between them. End section.